My name is Laurel Younis, and I'm a software engineer at 100 Devs. My connection to accessibility technology is not only as a user of it, but also as a mom. One of my kids is on the autism spectrum. When she was younger, she required the use of a digital communication board in order to speak with us. This product was life-changing for our family, and my first entry into the world of assistive technology. When I became a developer, I realized I could build products that could help not only people like my daughter, but millions of others that required accessible technology. You may not have experienced any disability in your lifetime, but if you think lack of accessibility on websites doesn't impact you, think again. We've all heard the saying that in life, nothing is certain except death and taxes. But what they should have said is that in life, nothing is certain except death, taxes, and aging. The harsh reality is that throughout our lifetime, we will all experience eyesight degeneration, our bodies breaking down, and varying sensory changes that will require the use of accessible technology. This indicates that the need for accessibility is no longer just for edge cases, but for us all. Not only is it ethically imperative to create inclusive products that benefit everyone, it's also a legal requirement. So, what exactly is web accessibility? To put it in simple terms, it means that all users, regardless of their abilities, are able to access and use digital tools, technologies, and websites, and that they can participate equally on the web. Now that we have a general understanding of accessibility, it's time to think about the users. Currently, there are thousands of recognized categories of disabilities that range from temporary ones, like a broken arm, to permanent ones, like a genetic disorder, all of which require different types of accommodations in order for users to have equal access to use our sites. So, how do we get started with accessibility? If you're anything like me, you start furiously searching Google. And that's when you come across a mountain of different information, checklists, and processes. Then you try to figure out what all the rules, laws, and regulations are. And that's when you come to a dead stop. Before you know it, you're completely overwhelmed and thrown right back into the depths of imposter syndrome. And you think to yourself, maybe this is just going to be too hard. I don't know if I can do this. Maybe somebody else should do this. And this is where a lot of people just stop and give up. But what you don't realize is that you've all been through the same experience before when you started to learn how to code. So take a deep breath and give yourself grace. Just like coding, the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. Some common terminology you'll come across while learning is WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These are international sets of guidelines that define how to make web content more accessible. WCAG has a ranking system, AAA, AA, and A, with AAA being the most restrictive and A being the least restrictive. Most sites strive for a minimum of AA. WCAG is developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, known as the W3C. A11Y stands for accessibility. Assistive technology, also known as AT, is devices, software, and equipment used to maintain or enhance the functional capabilities of people when accessing websites. Commonly used ATs include screen magnification software, alternative keyboards and input devices, and the use of voice recognition and screen readers. When it comes to learning, start by picking a single technical resource that goes over basic fundamentals and start working through it. There's a lot of great guides out there. Some I have personally found useful have been the MDM WebDoc accessibility guides, the WAI accessibility tutorials, the A11Y project, and DQ University. The next thing I recommend is to start building empathy and thinking about how people with different abilities interact with technology in non-traditional ways. For example, we may not think very often about what life would be like without sight. or what it's like to try to use a website without being able to see the keyboard or the screen. You can get a better understanding of what it's like by trying out a screen reader. Or imagine having a physical disability where you're unable to use a mouse and have to use a keyboard to navigate a site. You can see what this would be like just by unplugging your mouse and trying to access and navigate your favorite website with just your keyboard. Get familiar with different users with different abilities and the way they access and use websites. Find out what their experiences are like by talking to them, listening to their stories on podcasts, or reading about them in blogs. A good place to start figuring out accessibility issues that we can begin to tackle is the WebAIM Project's annual report, which shows the most common accessibility errors that occur across the top million homepages visited on the internet. Currently, the most common problems are lack of contrast in text, missing alternative text for images, empty links and buttons, and missing document language. Color contrast is the difference in brightness between foreground and background colors. Having the correct color contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 helps people with vision impairments be able to tell colors apart and see your content. To check color contrast, you can use a variety of automated tools. One that I currently use is a free Chrome extension called WCAG Color Contrast Checker. You can run the contrast checker on your site you're evaluating, and it will show you whether you have sufficient color contrast according to WCAG accessibility requirements. It can also simulate different visual impairments such as color blindness. You need to have alt text on most of your images. This is because not everyone who visits your site will be able to see those images. Some users will rely on screen readers or other AT software to read your pages out loud to them. If no alt text is provided for images on your site, the screen reader might just read out image or the file name for your image. Some good rules of thumb for alt text are, if you have images on your site that contain critical information, improve or provide context, then you need to include alt text for those images. Be specific and concise, using as few words as possible. Describe the information the image is conveying and not the aesthetics of the image. Or if the image is decorative, leave the alt text empty. Links, buttons, and other interactive elements need to have names in order for ATs to be able to interact with them. If there's nothing provided, ATs may just read these elements as null or empty string. For buttons, you can add text content within an empty button. Like the example here, where inside the element button, we state what the button does or what it's being used for. In this example, it's submit form. If the button is an image, you can add alternative text to the image that describes what the button is being used for or the action that the button triggers. For links, you need to use text to describe what the purpose of each link is and make it unique so that the user is able to differentiate between the different links and where they go. In this example, you can see that a link with the text read more doesn't give us a very good description. Instead, write text like read more about our company culture. You need to make sure that every interactive element has a label. This includes input fields, radio buttons, checkboxes, iframes, and regular buttons. You can accomplish this by using the HTML label element, as well as making sure that the for attribute matches the ID on the form. In some cases, you'll want to visually hide the elements from sighted users. In order to hide the information, but keep it available to screen readers and other ATs, you can use CSS, like this example that uses a class of visually hidden made with a CSS clip from Scott O'Hara that you add to your HTML and CSS. We also want to make sure that we set the value of the language attribute on our HTML tag. This enables screen readers and ATs to set their voice and dialect based on what the language attribute is set to. It also has an impact on spell check and translation. Just by knowing about these common accessibility errors and how to start fixing them, you've already made huge leaps and bounds on the road to making sure that your websites are accessible and legally compliant. Speaking of compliance, another thing we need to be aware of is that there are varying international laws, standards, guidelines, and criteria sites need to meet in order to be considered accessible. Without meeting these standards, you run the risk of a lawsuit. In 2021, thousands of web accessibility lawsuits were filed in the US alone. The most commonly cited law for accessibility in the United States is the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA. The ADA prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in places of public accommodation. Additionally, some states have created their own accessibility laws based on Section 508 or other standards. These are called mini 508s. For example, California's Unruh Act under Civil Code Sections 51 and 52 applies to websites of all businesses. The Unruh Act allows plaintiffs to claim 3 times damages per incident. Current U.S. courts have ruled overwhelmingly that websites need to be accessible, but they do not provide any formal guidelines or laws that dictate what determines whether a website is considered accessible or not. However, in recent years, courts have frequently referenced WCAG 2.0 AA guidelines and use them as a measurement to determine whether a site is considered accessible. To ensure sites are compliant, we need to do some testing. You should start testing as soon and often as possible. Start with an automated testing tool like Lighthouse or XDevTool Chrome extension to catch any obvious errors. To use Lighthouse, open up DevTools. At the right-hand corner, you'll see an option for Lighthouse. You can click on this and choose to run a generated accessibility report. While automated tools are great, they won't be able to detect up to 2/3 of the accessibility issues that may be present on your site. So we need to do some manual testing as well by using tools such as screen readers and other ATs to ensure that the site works as intended, as well as works via keyboard input only. Another great thing to do is user testing as early as possible in the process. This involves having persons with disabilities actually review and inspect your website for accessibility and give you feedback on the usability of your site. You'll also need to prioritize user feedback, starting with issues that block users from completing tasks. It's also great to do this kind of testing in a collaborative style and involve other team members, such as designers, content writers, product owners, and managers. Well, we've covered some of the basics of accessibility. We've really barely scratched the surface. And there are a lot of other tools, techniques, testing, and learning resources available that we haven't covered. So before we finish, I would like to give you one more tip, which is to get involved with the community and find others to learn and work with together. I cannot stress enough how much easier it is to learn when you're doing it with others. You can find a lot of communities and people learning about accessibility by using the A11Y hashtag on Twitter, as well as checking out meetups that focus on this topic, and just by posting publicly that you're interested in learning more. In wrapping up, I'd like to challenge you all today to spend a small amount of time each week learning something new about accessibility and sharing what you've learned with someone else. After a few months, you'll be surprised at how much knowledge you've gained just by putting in a small amount of time learning. I'm also always looking for recommendations and resources to learn more too. So if you have any recommendations or any questions, feel free to reach out to me anytime. Thank you for joining me today to learn about how to get started in web accessibility.